Across the sprawling, blood-soaked saga of Game of Thrones, villains are defined by steel, fire, and dark magic. We fear the Night King's army of the dead, Cersei's wildfire, and Ramsay Bolton's sadistic cruelty. We remember the clashing of swords, the roar of dragons, and the fall of castles. Yet the single most destructive force in Westeros never drew a blade in anger, never commanded an army, and never sat upon the Iron Throne. Petyr Littlefinger, Baelish dismantled the Seven Kingdoms not through conquest, but through ledgers, debt, and calculated embezzlement. He weaponized the mundane machinery of state finance to turn the crown's golden splendor into a hollow, rotting shell, ensuring total systemic collapse long before the first White Walker marched south or the first wildfire ignited beneath King's Landing. For decades, fans have fixated on his political scheming, his manipulation of noble houses, and his famous mantra that chaos is a ladder. But this surface-level reading misses the true genius of his master plan. His corruption of the Master of Coin's office was not a side hustle to fund his political ambitions. It was the foundation upon which all his other plots rested. By engineering systemic insolvency, manufacturing crippling national debt, and debasing the realm's currency, Littlefinger created the perfect conditions for civil war, social upheaval, and total institutional collapse. Every riot, every betrayal, every battle for the Iron Throne was fueled by the fiscal vacuum he deliberately carved into the heart of the Seven Kingdoms. This analysis will pull back the curtain on this hidden-in-plain-sight conspiracy, tracing how a minor lord from an insignificant house rose to become the realm's most powerful man by stealing it one gold dragon at a time. We will dissect the illusion of prosperity he crafted for the court, expose the shell game that emptied the royal treasury, examine how he turned the Iron Bank of Braavos into a weapon against the Baratheon dynasty, and connect the dots between fiscal ruin and the social collapse that tore Westeros apart. By the end, we will confront an uncomfortable truth. While others fought over the throne, Littlefinger ensured that whoever won would inherit nothing but a bankrupt, ungovernable ruin. The illusion of prosperity, from full coffers to 6 million dragons in debt. When Robert Baratheon seized the Iron Throne after the rebellion, he inherited a treasury overflowing with gold. Tywin Lannister, who had served as Aerys Targaryen's Master of Coin for 20 years, had left the realm's finances in impeccable order. Taxes were collected efficiently, debts were paid promptly, and the crown held substantial reserves to fund wars, infrastructure, and royal expenditures. Within just 15 years of Robert's reign, that surplus had vanished entirely, replaced by a staggering national debt of 6 million gold dragons, an amount equivalent to more than a decade of total royal tax revenue. This suspicious, precipitous collapse was no accident. It was the deliberate work of Petyr Baelish, who was appointed Master of Coin in 298 AC and immediately set about dismantling the realm's fiscal foundation. Littlefinger understood that the easiest way to hide theft and debt was behind a facade of lavish, unending celebration. Robert Baratheon was a man of insatiable appetites. He loved tournaments, feasts, hunts, and brothels, and he cared nothing for ledgers or interest rates. Baelish catered to every one of these vices, convincing the king that endless luxury was the birthright of a victorious conqueror. He organized grand tournaments that cost hundreds of thousands of gold dragons each, hosted weekly feasts for the entire court, and funded the king's extravagant personal lifestyle without ever presenting a balanced budget or warning of impending financial ruin. To pay for this artificial prosperity, Baelish embarked on an aggressive campaign of high-interest borrowing. He took loans from wealthy merchants, noble houses, and most critically, the Iron Bank of Braavos loans, with exorbitant interest rates that compounded rapidly, turning small debts into insurmountable obligations. He never used crown revenue to pay down the principal. Instead, he borrowed more money to make interest payments, creating a vicious cycle that spiraled out of control. The nobility, blinded by the court's glittering wealth, never questioned where the money was coming from. They grew dependent on Baelish's financial miracles, relying on his patronage for loans, positions, and access to royal favor. Even Tywin Lannister, the most astute businessman in the realm, failed to detect the scale of the fraud until it was far too late, distracted by his political rivalry with the Starks and his obsession with restoring Lannister prestige. By the time Ned Stark arrived in King's Landing to serve as Hand of the King, the crown was already functionally bankrupt. The treasury held less than 1 million gold dragons in reserves, and monthly interest payments alone consumed more than half of all royal tax revenue. Yet the feasts continued, the tournaments went on, and the court remained oblivious to the fiscal catastrophe unfolding beneath their feet. Baelish had created a perfect bubble of false prosperity, one that would burst the moment the realm faced any serious crisis, whether that crisis was a civil war, a winter famine, or an invasion from beyond the wall. The shell game of King's Landing, embezzlement and cronyism. Borrowing alone could not have emptied the treasury or enriched Baelish to the extent he achieved. His true genius lay in the elaborate shell game he ran out of the Master of Coin's offices, a system of accounting fraud and cronyism that siphoned millions of gold dragons from the crown into his own private coffers, while making it appear as though the realm's finances were still stable. The core of this scheme was simple. He moved money around between dozens of dummy accounts and shell companies, creating the illusion of revenue and expenditure where none existed, and using new loans to cover up the missing funds. Every time tax revenue was collected from the Seven Kingdoms, Baelish would divert a substantial portion into his own accounts before depositing the remainder into the royal treasury. To hide this theft, he forged ledgers, created fake receipts, and invented non-existent expenses to balance the books. He would record payments for royal supplies that were never delivered, salaries for servants who never existed, and maintenance costs for castles that were never repaired. No one in the court had the financial acumen or the motivation to audit his books. The nobles considered accounting beneath their dignity, and the king cared more about his next hunt than the contents of the treasury. To ensure his fraud went undetected, Baelish strategically placed his own cronies in every key financial position across the realm. He appointed loyalists as customs officers in every major port, wine factors in every city, and tax collectors in every region. These men answered only to Baelish, not the crown, and they split the embezzled funds with him in exchange for their positions. Customs duties, which should have been the crown's largest source of revenue, were systematically underreported. Wine taxes were siphoned off before they ever reached the treasury, and land taxes were reduced for nobles who paid bribes to Baelish's network. The embezzled gold did not sit idle in Baelish's vaults. He reinvested it into a vast empire of private businesses across Westeros and Essos, brothels, taverns, merchant ships, mines, and landholdings. These investments generated massive passive income, which he used to buy loyalty, fund his political schemes, and further expand his financial empire. He lent money to cash-strapped nobles, binding them to his will through debt. He bribed guards, servants, and spies to infiltrate every household in King's Landing, and he purchased vast tracts of land in the Vale and the Riverlands, building a personal power base that rivaled that of many great houses. By the start of the War of the Five Kings, Baelish was the single wealthiest man in Westeros, even as the crown he served was on the brink of insolvency. The crown could not afford to pay its soldiers or buy grain for the coming winter, but Baelish had enough gold to raise private armies, bribe entire noble houses, and fund entire wars single-handedly. He had successfully separated the realm's wealth from the realm's government, turning the Master of Coin's office into a personal printing press for gold and power. The crown's credit was disintegrating, but Baelish's personal credit was impeccable. He had created a system where the weaker the crown became, the stronger he grew. Weaponizing the Iron Bank, the poison pill for the Baratheon dynasty, the most devastating stroke of Baelish's master plan was his deliberate weaponization of the Iron Bank of Braavosi, the most powerful financial institution in the known world. The Iron Bank does not care about kings, crowns, or dynasties. It cares only about being repaid with interest. It has a long history of funding rebellions, assassinations, and regime changes to ensure that its loans are honored, and it will always back the candidate most likely to repay its debts. Baelish understood this perfectly, and he manipulated the Iron Bank into becoming the ultimate executioner of the Baratheon dynasty. For years, Baelish made regular, partial payments on the Crown's loans to the Iron Bank, just enough to keep the bank from calling in the debt entirely. He intentionally missed payments, made late payments, and sent incomplete sums, gradually eroding the bank's trust in the Baratheon regime. He leaked false information to the bank's agents, exaggerating the Crown's financial instability and convincing them that Robert Baratheon and his heirs were never going to repay their debts. At the same time, he made sure that his own personal loans to the Iron Bank were always paid on time and in full, establishing himself as a reliable, trustworthy borrower in the bank's eyes. When Joffrey Baratheon ascended the throne after Robert's death, Baelish deliberately defaulted on all payments to the Iron Bank. This was not an oversight, it was a calculated provocation. The Iron Bank responded exactly as Baelish knew it would. It cut off all further lending to the Crown, demanded immediate repayment of the entire outstanding debt, and began looking for a new ruler in Westeros who would honor the Baratheon obligations. The bank first turned to Stannis Baratheon, funding his invasion of the North, and later switched its support to Tywin Lannister and the Lannister regime. While the Crown was cut off from all international credit and spiraling into bankruptcy, Baelish suddenly had access to unlimited liquidity from the Iron Bank for his own personal projects. He used bank loans to fund his takeover of the Vale, to raise private armies, and to bribe his way into positions of ever greater power. The contrast could not have been starker. The King of the Seven Kingdoms could not borrow a single gold dragon to feed his people, but Petyr Baelish could raise millions to fund his private wars and political schemes. This deliberate default was the ultimate poison pill for the Baratheon dynasty. By turning the Iron Bank into an enemy, Baelish ensured that no Baratheon king would ever be able to govern effectively. A bankrupt crown cannot pay its soldiers, cannot feed its people, cannot maintain its castles, and cannot command the loyalty of its lords. The Iron Bank's withdrawal of support stripped the Baratheons of their last remaining legitimacy, turning them into figureheads propped up only by Lannister gold and Lannister swords. When the Lannisters' own wealth eventually ran dry, there was nothing left to hold the realm together. Baelish had not just bankrupted the Crown, he had destroyed the very foundation of royal authority in Westeros: hyperinflation and social erosion. The riot that was always inevitable. The fiscal collapse engineered by Baelish did not remain confined to the royal treasury or the noble courts. It trickled down to the small folk of Westeros, destroying their livelihoods, driving them into poverty, and creating the conditions for widespread social unrest. The first and most devastating consequence of the Crown's insolvency was hyperinflation, triggered by Baelish's decision to debase the realm's currency to pay for royal expenditures. When the Crown could no longer borrow enough gold to fund its operations, Baelish ordered the royal mint to reduce the gold content of the gold dragon coin, mixing in cheaper metals like copper and silver to stretch the Crown's limited reserves. This debasement meant that each coin was worth less than its face value, leading to a rapid rise in prices for all basic goods. Bread, meat, ale, and firewood, essentials that the small folk relied on for survival, doubled, then tripled, then quadrupled in price within just a few years. Wages for labourers and craftsmen remained stagnant, meaning that ordinary people could no longer afford to feed their families or heat their homes. The suffering of the small folk was compounded by the Crown's inability to maintain basic services. Roads fell into disrepair, bridges collapsed, and the city watch of King's Landing was left unpaid and understaffed, leading to a surge in crime and violence. When winter arrived, bringing with it freezing temperatures and failed harvests, the situation became catastrophic. Thousands of people starved to death in the streets of King's Landing alone, while the nobility continued to feast and celebrate in the Red Keep, oblivious to the suffering outside their walls. This economic desperation created the perfect breeding ground for radical religious movements like the Sparrows. The Sparrows were a grassroots movement of poor, devout peasants who rejected the corruption and decadence of the faith of the Seven's established hierarchy. They preached a message of equality, poverty, and divine justice, blaming the nobility and the wealthy for the realm's suffering. Baelish's fiscal policies had turned millions of desperate, angry people against the ruling class, and the Sparrows gave them a voice and a cause to rally around. When the High Septon was murdered and the High Sparrow rose to power, he was able to mobilize thousands of followers to seize control of King's Landing, arrest the Queen, and challenge the authority of the Iron Throne itself. The riots that erupted in King's Landing throughout the War of the Five Kings were not random acts of violence or political accidents. They were the inevitable, predictable result of Baelish's systemic fiscal neglect. The smallfolk did not riot because they loved the Starks or hated the Lannisters. They rioted because they were hungry, cold, and dying, and the crown had abandoned them. Baelish did not start the riots himself, but he created the conditions that made them unavoidable. He understood that a hungry, angry populace is a destabilizing force, and he used that instability to his advantage, manipulating the chaos to climb higher on his ladder of power. Every riot, every Sparrow March, every act of social unrest weakened the crown further and strengthened Baelish's position as the only man with the gold and the influence to restore order. The architecture of total collapse, a scorched earth fiscal policy. By the end of the War of the Five Kings, Baelish had achieved what no army or dragon ever could. He had completely destroyed the fiscal and institutional foundation of the Seven Kingdoms. His tenure as Master of Coin amounted to a form of economic scorched earth, leaving the realm so thoroughly bankrupt and broken that no ruler, no matter how competent or just, could ever hope to govern it effectively. A bankrupt state cannot fulfill the most basic functions of government. It cannot defend its borders against foreign invaders or internal rebellions because it cannot pay its soldiers. It cannot maintain law and order because it cannot fund its police forces or its courts. It cannot provide for its people during times of crisis because it has no reserves of grain or gold. It cannot command the loyalty of its lords because it has no favors to grant and no punishments to inflict. When the White Walkers marched south and Daenerys Targaryen arrived with her dragons, the Seven Kingdoms had no central government capable of organizing a unified defense. Each noble house was left to fend for itself, hoarding its own gold and its own soldiers, because the crown had nothing left to offer. The long-term damage caused by Baelish's policies extended far beyond the immediate fiscal crisis. He had eroded public trust in every institution of government, the crown, the faith, the nobility, and the law. The smallfolk had learned that their rulers cared nothing for their suffering, and the nobility had learned that loyalty to the crown was worthless. The entire feudal system that had governed Westeros for thousands of years was irreparably damaged, replaced by a brutal system of might makes right, where power was measured in gold and swords rather than birthright or honor. While other characters fought and died for the Iron Throne, Baelish watched from the shadows, manipulating every conflict to his advantage. He knew that the throne itself was worthless. The real power lay in controlling the realm's wealth and the chaos that his fiscal policies had created. He played the Starks against the Lannisters, the Baratheons against the Tyrells, and the Sparrows against everyone, ensuring that no single house could ever gain enough power to challenge him. He intended to be the power behind the throne, the man who pulled the strings while some figurehead king sat upon the Iron Throne and ruled over a hollow, broken realm. In the end, Baelish's own ambition and arrogance proved to be his undoing. He was executed by Arya Stark in Winterfell before he could see his final plan come to fruition. But even in death, he achieved his greatest victory. The realm he left behind was exactly the realm he had designed, a bankrupt, war-torn, divided ruin where no one could ever truly hold power for long. Whoever won the Game of Thrones would inherit nothing but ashes. The Iron Throne was eventually destroyed, and the Seven Kingdoms were split apart. But Baelish's legacy lived on in the economic devastation and social chaos that plagued Westeros for generations to come. Petyr Baelish was far more than a clever schemer or a manipulative social climber. He was the most destructive force in the history of Westeros, a man who dismantled an entire civilization not with swords or dragons, but with ledgers, loans, and accounting fraud. His greatest trick was convincing everyone that his power lay in his ability to manipulate people and events, when in reality it lay in his complete control of the realm's finances. Every other villain in Game of Thrones destroyed individual people or individual cities. Baelish destroyed the very fabric of society itself. The lesson of Baelish's reign of fiscal terror is a timeless one. The most dangerous threats are not the ones that roar and brandish swords. They are the ones that hide in plain sight, operating within the mundane machinery of government, slowly eroding the foundations of society from within. While everyone was looking at the battles and the betrayals, Baelish was quietly stealing the realm, one gold dragon at a time, and no one noticed until it was far too late. He proved that economic power is the ultimate power, that he who controls the gold controls everything else. His legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, governance, and morality. Is a leader who uses brutal, unethical means to achieve order better than a leader who allows chaos and suffering through inaction? Is financial corruption a greater threat to a nation than military invasion? And who is the true villain, the man who fights with a sword or the man who fights with a ledger? Now I pose these questions to you. Do you believe Petyr Baelish was the most dangerous villain in Game of Thrones? Or do you think his economic destruction was less significant than the military and magical threats facing Westeros? Would the Seven Kingdoms have collapsed into civil war without his fiscal meddling, or was he the single catalyst that brought down an entire dynasty? Leave your detailed thoughts and arguments in the comment section below, and share which aspect of Baelish's master plan you find most chilling.